Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So indeed, with Michel Gregor, we organize this webinar series. And today we are very happy to have Brady Ferster to give a presentation. So Brady obtained his Bachelor of Science in Meteorology from Pennsylvania State University in 2016. And just this year obtained his PhD in Marine Science from the University of South Carolina, working on the role of the Southern Ocean on global ocean circulation and climate. Brady is currently a postdoctoral researcher with Alexei Fedorov at the Laboratoire de l'Océanographie et du Climat, or LOCEAN, at the Institut Pierre-Simon Laplace in Paris, where he's working on climate variability and global teleconnection. And this is why we invited Brady today to give a webinar, since the US CLIVAR Post panel has identified as one of its priorities the dynamics of large to regional scale teleconnections between low and high latitudes. That being said, the title of Brady's talk today is The Role of Teleconnections in Southern Ocean SST Variability. Brady, go ahead, please.
All right, thank you, Shane. And thank you to everyone who is listening today for this presentation and to those who have organized the talk in the background. I'm very happy to be presenting on part of my dissertation at my time at the University of South Carolina. And as Shane mentioned, today I will be discussing the role of teleconnections in the Southern Ocean, sea surface temperature variability. I would like to acknowledge my collaborators, Subra Balusu, who is my PhD advisor, as well as Allison McDonald, who are both very instrumental in this work and throughout my PhD. And before I get any further, I'd also like to note that this work was funded through the NASA South Carolina Space Grant Graduate Assistantship. The purpose of my contribution and this presentation is to readdress the literature. A motivation for the study is to revisit many of the previous studies in the Southern Ocean that use observational data products. The Southern Ocean is known to have a lack of high latitude observations in both time and space, in part due to the harsh austral winter conditions, and another due to the vast area of the Southern Ocean, particularly in the very high latitudes. Observational data within the Southern Ocean has greatly improved with the help of the Argo projects and has given way to many observations, analyses, and data products. However, many of these past studies that began to look at such atmospheric relationships did not extend into the high latitudes of the Southern Hemisphere, particularly as a result of this data gap. Many have only gone to about 40, maybe 60 degrees south. This alone supports the motivation to confirm the relationship of sea surface temperature and teleconnections within the Southern Ocean. Another problem that exists within the Southern Ocean is the understanding of the internal variability and the spatial patterns. We have been able to observe changes within the Southern Ocean sea surface temperature and heat content, but have not been able to attribute all the variability within the system. And again, to be able to attribute these patterns of variability to within the high latitudes of the Antarctic coast and the sea ice extent. Finally, many of the high latitude variability analyses rely on model or reanalysis products, which in turn use some sort of model physics, which again are not always perfect. And some such reanalysis products go back to the 1900s, where there is a lack of data in the Southern Ocean for many of these. Here we propose an analysis that uses satellite-derived sea surface temperature, which can be acquired as monthly products, as well as extend back surface observations to about 1981 with high spatial resolution. With the satellite-derived sea surface temperature, we had two main objectives. The first was to find a spatial relationship of sea surface temperature with the atmospheric teleconnections on monthly and yearly scales, confirming the Antarctic Oscillation and Southern Oscillation relationship with sea surface temperature in the Southern Hemisphere. Second, we wanted to compare the seasonal variability and trends of these teleconnections and sea surface temperature. There's been a lot of effort within the Southern Ocean exploring changes in the sea surface temperature and the heat content within the surface 2,000 meters. And in fact, many of these studies estimate warming between 0.1 to 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade throughout the mid-latitude and Antarctic circumpolar current region of the Southern Ocean. Not only that, it is thought that the Southern Ocean is warming at a faster rate than the global mean upper ocean. In the figure provided, the upper ocean heat content exhibits this warming pattern throughout much of the ACC and mid-latitudes of the Indian and Pacific basins, while there are negative trends throughout much of the high latitude of the Central South Pacific. As seen in the last figure, the mid-latitude positive trends dominate the signal throughout much of the Southern Ocean. In this figure provided now, the Southern Ocean sea surface temperature is averaged between 30 to 60 degrees south, excluding the higher latitudes, and isn't a spatial representation for the entire Southern Ocean. In this example, there is warming of about 0.116 degrees Celsius per decade within the mid-latitudes and ACC region. This estimate is similar to the previous studies. This linear regression alone, though, accounts for about 68.5% of the variability, and that's the R-squared value. Although there is a large linear component of this SST, there is still strong interannual variability that is not explained by this trend. To explore this variability, we decided to look at the atmospheric teleconnections. The first teleconnection is the Antarctic Oscillation. This is also commonly referred to as the Southern Annual Mode, or the SAM. This pattern was originally identified using the 850 hectopascal geopotential height anomalies south of 20 degrees south, using the leading principal component in UF1. This pattern represents the dominant mode of variability in the high latitude southern hemisphere and exhibits a large-scale, low-frequency pattern of variability. The largest variability is exhibited in the austral winter months. In a positive phase, there are high-pressure signals in the mid-latitude, particularly over New Zealand and the South Indian Ocean, as indicated in the figure, while there are low-pressure signals over the Antarctic continental region. Moreover, the strongest pattern of the variability exists over the Amundsen Sea region. The product that we'll be using in this analysis is the NOAA product derived from the NCEP-NCAR reanalysis. Additionally, it is thought that this pattern has exhibited more positive phases within the recent decades. This would support more consistent periods of negative pressure anomalies over the Antarctic continent and relatively higher pressure anomalies within the mid-latitude. With this, we would want to explain potentially part of this linear trend line and the variability. The second index we used in this analysis is the Southern Oscillation. The Southern Oscillation is the atmospheric component of ENSO. The index is based on the observed sea level pressure difference between Tahiti and Darwin, Australia, and aligns similarly to the location of the Niño 3.4 index. In the Southern Oscillation Index, a positive value reflects La Niña-like conditions, while a negative Southern Oscillation Index mirrors El Niño conditions. During the negative phase of the Southern Oscillation, atmospheric convection shifts towards the Central Pacific, warm sea surface temperatures are spread eastward across the equatorial Pacific, and the thermocline deepens. The opposite is true during the Southern Oscillation positive events, or La Niña conditions. And to be consistent using atmospheric teleconnections, we have decided to use the NOAA Climate Prediction Center Southern Oscillation Index. Knowing that there are strong patterns of trends within the Southern Ocean, we wanted to address the following questions to help better explain why sea surface temperature anomalies don't perfectly fit this trend line, or rather to explain why the red curve is not identical to the blue line. The first question to address, do these oscillations drive warm anomaly patterns in the mid-latitudes of the Southern Ocean? Second, do the spatial relationships of sea surface temperature vary seasonally or intra-annually? To address these questions, the data we use throughout these analyses is the optimal interpolated sea surface temperature version 2, the OISST product. This product is statistically blended into a quarter-degree resolution going back to 1981. And for this analysis, I decided to use whole years, so we used 1982 to 2017. In using this product, I computed the analyses using sea surface temperature anomalies. In doing so, I've removed seasonality and divided by the standard deviation, standardizing the anomalies in a similar method to how the indices are computed. All right, to begin, these plots are the correlation at zero lag between the standardized sea surface temperature anomalies and the Antarctic Oscillation, figure A, and the Southern Oscillation, figure B. During positive Antarctic Oscillation events, there is a poleward shift in the westerlies, while a positive Southern Oscillation describes anomalously cold temperatures in the western equatorial Pacific, shifting the convection and atmospheric patterns similar to La Niña. Using sea surface temperature, the measurement is representative of the top few centimeters, or the surface skin, and therefore offers the opportunity to explore this relationship with the atmospheric teleconnections. Figure A depicts a relationship with the Antarctic Oscillation. There are positive correlations in the mid-latitude Indian and Western Pacific basins, while negative correlations in the central South Pacific and spatially within the high latitudes. This means that during a positive phase of the Antarctic Oscillation, there are positive sea surface temperature anomalies in the Indian and Western Pacific Basin and negative anomalies in the South Pacific. Figure B is the correlation values between the Southern Oscillation and sea surface temperature anomalies. A similar pattern exists in the high latitudes, where there are negative anomalies within the South Pacific and along the Antarctic coast between 0 to 80 degrees east. There are also patterns of positive anomalies in the mid-latitudes and ACC regions of all three basins. This result suggests that during a positive phase of the Southern Oscillation, or La Niña, there is warming in the mid-latitudes and cooling in the higher latitudes, specifically in the South Pacific. Moreover, the strongest relationship in both of these are within sea surface temperature anomalies in the Southern Oscillation. In Figure A, the coefficients of regression are plotted from the spatially estimated 36-year linear trend. Regions within the black contours are significant at the 95% confidence interval. Within this figure, there is a broad scale warming throughout the mid-latitudes and ACC region, as well as parts of the Amundsen Sea. There are also regions of negative trends, suggesting decreasing temperatures in parts of the high latitude Central South Pacific, the Drake Passage, and near the Antarctic coast at 40 degrees east. The spatial pattern of these trends is similar to previous studies, where cooling or no trends in much of the polar latitudes, while warming in much of the equatorial and equatorialward of the ACC. Figures B and C represent two important scenarios. B are the mean anomalies from 2016, and C are the mean anomalies from 2011. The year 2016 is shown first, as this year was part El Nino that turned into La Nina, while the Antarctic Oscillation was consistently positive. These yearly anomalies show some consistency with the linear trends and the patterns to the teleconnections, where we do see negative anomalies within the Drake Passage, and regionally there are some positive anomalies in the mid-latitude. However, the variability is not explained by the trend itself or the teleconnections, but in part by the variability in these indices being out of phase. Figure C represents when a period of both the Antarctic Oscillation and Southern Oscillation are simultaneously in positive phases of the index. This pattern of anomalies represents that of the trends, and the spatial correlations of the teleconnections very well, where we see broad-scale positive anomalies in the mid-latitudes and part of the ACC region, while negative anomalies in the Central South Pacific, the Drake Passage, and the region near 40 degrees east. From the figure in slide 4 I showed previously, the linear trend represents a substantial part of the variability, but is also significantly related to these atmospheric teleconnections as well. This figure depicts three different scenarios as well. Plot A depicts the mean anomalies during months in a positive Antarctic Oscillation phase, while again in a neutral Southern Oscillation phase. Plot B are the mean monthly anomalies when the Southern Oscillation is positive and the Antarctic Oscillation is neutral. And figure C are the mean anomalies when both the Antarctic and Southern Oscillations are in positive phases. Beginning with plot A, the anomalies during a positive Antarctic Oscillation phase are similar to the pattern in the correlation values. There are positive anomalies in the mid-latitude Indian and Western Pacific Basin and within the ACC region of the Atlantic Basin. There are also positive anomalies stretching from the Ross to the Amundsen Sea. Throughout much of the high latitudes, however, there are negative anomalies. This pattern of anomalies is very similar to the correlation and the spatial pattern of the EOF of the Antarctic Oscillation I've shown previously. This shows that during Antarctic Oscillation events, there are spatial patterns at zero lag. In regions that the atmosphere geopotential height increases, there are similarly co-located positive sea surface temperature anomalies in the mid-latitude. Also, there are negative sea surface temperature anomalies within the higher latitudes, where there are negative pressure anomalies surrounding the Antarctic continental coast. Plot B depicts all of the months during positive Southern Oscillation events and the neutral Antarctic Oscillation. The spatial pattern is again like that of the correlations to the Southern Oscillation. There are positive anomalies in the mid-latitude Pacific and throughout the ACC region, and negative anomalies in the South Pacific and along the Antarctic coast. These anomalies reflect what is known regarding the sea surface temperature anomalies during a La Nina event, where the mid-latitude Pacific is warmer than normal and the South Pacific is cooler than normal. Additionally, there is a negative anomaly signal between 0 to 80 degrees east, which was further depicted in the correlations. Plot C is when both oscillations are in positive phases. During these months, there are strong positive anomalies in the mid-latitudes and very strong negative anomalies in the higher latitudes. That is, positive phases are strongly correlated to the Amundsen Sea low and have a direct result of the sea surface temperature of this region. While simultaneously, both positive indices exhibit a shift in the atmospheric patterns, and as a result, in warm anomalies throughout much of the mid-latitude of the Southern Ocean. The resulting in-phase relationship increases the magnitude of the anomalies, as well as being spatially broader than when the indices are out of phase. This is important to note that within recent decades, the Antarctic Oscillation has been in more positive phases than negative. And when both of these indices are in positive phases, we expect to see anomalies very similar to these patterns shown. And the opposite is true when there's a negative Antarctic Oscillation and El Nino events. A comparison of monthly and yearly average standardized sea surface temperature anomalies mark contrasting differences between the temporal scales of the Antarctic Oscillation and the Southern Oscillation. The monthly and yearly average standardized sea surface temperature anomalies during positive Antarctic Oscillation events both have negative anomalies in the Pacific Basin and positive anomalies in the Atlantic and Indian Basin. On longer timescales, this yearly pattern of anomalous temperatures is stronger than monthly average. Differences in the yearly and monthly Antarctic Oscillation anomalies show the stronger yearly signal, particularly in the Pacific Basin and parts of the Atlantic, while weaker anomalies in the mid-latitude Indian and Atlantic basins. The pattern of sea surface temperature anomalies seen during positive Southern Oscillation monthly and yearly periods are similar, with the intensification throughout the mid-latitude Indian and Atlantic basins, while weakening throughout the mid-latitude Pacific over time. This temporal disparity is most likely due to the time required for an equatorial tropical Pacific phenomenon to influence these larger regions, even atmospherically. A distinguishing feature of these patterns is that the magnitude of the positive Southern Oscillation events in the Pacific Basin is greater than those associated with the Antarctic Oscillation. The potential implication is that the Southern Oscillation plays a dominant role in the Southern Ocean sea surface temperature and could further influence the signal of the Antarctic Oscillation. Furthermore, the differences in the yearly and monthly average anomalies are comparatively large compared to the anomalies. Thus, longer duration of these positive or negative phase events could be an effective means for supporting or driving these long-term trends in the Southern Ocean. Although global air-sea interactions are heavily influenced by large-scale teleconnections, seasonal regressions derive a response in sea surface temperature to changes in the index values. On the top row, I have seasonal regressions with the Antarctic Oscillation, and the bottom row, I have those with the Southern Oscillation. In both instances, the largest coefficients of regression occur in the austral spring, summer, and autumn months, October through June, while the weakest coefficients arise in austral winter, for this July through September. Based on these figures, changes in the indices can be used to depict linear changes in temperature, except throughout the austral winter months. Seasonally, these plots show a low significance within the austral winter months. This does not mean that the variability within the winter sea surface temperature, it just means that the variability outside the Pacific Basin for the Southern Oscillation is really not significantly regressed with the indices in this case. Although this pattern tested for a linear relationship, correlation values are also very low in the austral winter months. This suggests that the signal could be lost through natural variability or on shorter scales, or lost to other ocean dynamic processes or potential lag in this relationship. All right, for a brief conclusion, we have confirmed the relationship of the atmospheric teleconnections to sea surface temperature in the Southern Ocean and have answered our two main objectives. First, the spatial relationship with sea surface temperature. Sea surface temperatures are significantly correlated with both the Antarctic and Southern Oscillations on monthly and yearly scales. Moreover, the Southern Oscillation, although more of a tropical signal, has a strong magnitude and spatial relationship with sea surface temperatures and has a stronger one than that of the Antarctic Oscillation. We have additionally concluded that positive patterns in the Antarctic Oscillation and Southern Oscillation are driving cooling patterns in the high latitude Southern Ocean and warming in the mid latitudes, particularly when the two phases are in sync. Second, we have addressed the seasonality in these patterns. Regressions between the indices and sea surface temperature indicate a strong seasonality in response to the atmospheric circulation. The strongest feedbacks occur throughout the austral summer months, mainly December through May. The strongest Antarctic Oscillation patterns are throughout January to May, while the strongest Southern Oscillations are from April to June. The austral winter shows the weakest relationship with the indices, with a relative lack of significance in the relationship. To build off the study, additional work could be done using a state estimate product currently available, such as Echo or SST, and that would be to better connect all the physical dynamics that could be driving the system to change rather than just using sea surface temperature from satellite products. Additionally, I hope this work supports the use of observational data, whether it's satellite or in situ based products. With that, I would like to thank everyone who put this seminar together, and for those listening today, I would like to thank my former advisor, Subra, and Allison for their contributions. Additionally, if you would like to read the corresponding manuscript, Confirmation of ENSO Southern Ocean Teleconnections Using Satellite-Derived Sea Surface Temperature, this was published back in 2018 in Remote Sensing. I would also like to thank all of my funding sources, those from my time in South Carolina and those that I currently have at LOCEAN Sorbonne. With that, I would like to open the remaining time for questions.
Great. Thank you, Brady. As a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute to ask it, or you can also type your questions into the chat box and I'll ask it for you. So any questions for Brady?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm curious about the seasonality of the teleconnections, considering a lot of the time tropical to extratropical teleconnections are supposed to be strongest in the winter hemisphere, but yet you're finding, particularly in this case, that it's strongest during the austral summer from the Southern Oscillation Index.
Yes.
And so I guess if you could comment on sort of those differences from expectation.
Yeah, so it is a bit different than expectation. And again, we were looking at more the atmospheric side than rather say the ocean side of transports. But I will go ahead. I have some extra slides here. But here are the correlation coefficients. And it was a bit actually confusing to me at first too, because I've read a lot in the literature stating, the winter we would expect. But honestly, I think it may just be because there is the largest variability in the winter. And perhaps when we find these 95% confidence intervals, it is just lost through the natural variability of the system. I'm not saying there isn't a big influence. It's just statistically, it was not found to be significant in this case.
This is Sergey. I have a question. You probably have mentioned it, or maybe it's a kind of well-known fact in this field. So is it the magnitude of winds that modulates this cooling, or is it cloud cover? Can you talk about some physical mechanisms of how these large-scale patterns affect SST?
Yeah, so again, since we were looking at atmospheric, I believe the best way to look at this would be through comparing, say, atmospheric temperature. So we do have these change in geopotential heights. These geopotential heights are, as you mentioned, going to relate to the wind, but are also going to relate to this atmospheric temperature. So the idea of what we were looking at, and I did mention potentially using echo or another state estimate, but there would be this feedback, this air-sea interaction. We do see, say, a deepening low that typically corresponds to cooler temperature, and then the actual surface of the ocean is either going to take in or release energy to the atmosphere. So in regions where we would see decreasing temperatures, since this is a surface skin, we would expect an air-sea interaction, mostly with these atmospheric temperatures. And when we see, so increasing temperatures, we would see increasing atmospheric, and decreasing sea surface temperatures, we would expect decreasing atmosphere, as they kind of modulate and share their energy.
I mean, I would be surprised if it's the sensible heat flux that kind of, you have cooler temperatures and hence you have cooler SSTs. I would expect it has more to do with maybe vertical mixing in the ocean, or maybe, if you have more cloud cover, there'll be less radiation.
Yes, and I agree with that. And I would love to take echo or SOCI and actually go in and look at all the different breakdowns of the energy budget on the zero lag timescale. So kind of just forgetting about the transports of the ocean, but actually look at, say, maybe it is mixing, or maybe it is actually latent sensible heat fluxes that are dominating this pattern.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Hi, Brady. I have a question concerning this modes of variability that you have considered. So is it known if the Antarctic Oscillation and the Southern Oscillation are independent? Could the Antarctic Oscillation also reflect changes in the Southern Oscillation?
Yeah, so there actually are papers on that. So the Antarctic variability does play a role on the Southern Oscillation does play a role on the Antarctic Oscillation. So it can modulate, particularly over the Amundsen Sea, where that low is. It can modulate the pressures there, and that can therefore dictate the effects of the Antarctic Oscillation. So there is, they are connected, and they do play a role in interchanging and how they interact with the ocean temperatures.
I think also would be interesting, you have a relatively, I think you start from 1980, if I remember your...
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so the time record is not too long, but would be interesting to see whether there are differences in these teleconnections between Central Pacific and Eastern Pacific ENSO events.
It would be very interesting. I think it would be hard at this point particularly just with our time series going back to the 80s, but then how many ENSO events we really have there.
Yeah, you don't have enough.
But, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something to look forward to the future.
Okay.
Any other questions for Brady?
If no one else has one, I'll ask another one. Also looking sort of at the Southern Oscillation Index impacts. You sort of hinted at the fact that there could be lead lag regression as well, and you're only showing contemporaneous. And we also know, or that ENSO peaks in the boreal winter or the austral summer.
Yes.
And so I'm curious if there's sort of a seasonal connection potentially between, or if you look at sort of in terms of ENSO years, where you look in sort of the developing versus decaying phases of ENSO and sort of center around the ENSO peak, or if if that's seeing something somewhat different versus the just straight seasonal breakdowns with contemporaneous SOI.
Yeah, so we didn't look too much into, say, a strong or weak event, but this one. We're trying to look at that somewhat here with figure B and C, when we have one that's perfectly in phase, and then we have one that kind of transitioned into from an El Nino to a La Nina phase. And I guess, yeah, so we did find the strongest correlation to Southern Oscillation in this April time period, which is delayed compared to when we expect El Nino to be at its peak. So there definitely could be, I guess, a buildup and a later delay to these. But since these were atmospheric connections, we were just looking strictly at the zero lag. But again, I do think there are going to be an atmospheric lag, which is why we tried to look at yearly anomalies, not just monthly. And I definitely think there's still a component involved from these subsurface, just ocean transports, that there's more to explain in this linear trend than just an instantaneous. There's going to be a lag part too, that we just didn't consider at this time.
Okay, thank you.
We have one question from Shane in the chat box. He asks, could you comment on possible implications of these SST patterns on SSH variability?
That's a good question. Yeah, so actually, it's quite interesting. So I have this figure up now. When you look at the linear trends for sea surface height, they're very similar to what we see spatially to the sea surface temperature right now, where much of the mid-latitudes and much of the ACC region is increasing, but then part of the Central Pacific, the sea surface height is decreasing. And that's very co-located with the temperature trend. So I haven't looked at the sea surface height patterns with ENSO or the Antarctic Oscillation, but I would assume as we change these temperatures at the surface, we would also have a similar looking pattern to the sea surface height within the Southern Ocean.
Any final questions for Brady? All right, I think it's 12:30 over here, so I think we'll wrap up. So thank you again, Brady, for presenting and answering all the questions from our audience. We had a really good turnout and a great presentation by you. We appreciate you taking your time to give this talk. So a recording of this webinar will be available by next week, and I'll send out an email once it's uploaded. Our next POS panel webinar is tentatively scheduled for January 2nd, so I'll send out additional details once they are confirmed. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today.